There is a lack of understanding on why this is so important. And still we're talking so much about well-being today. We talk so much about sick leaves, talk so much about what you can do to feel better. We talk about exercise, and we talk about restoration, but we don't talk enough about what you can do to actually get that restoration and how you can get that at work. When you look at like different suggestions for like, okay, so this is ways that you can recover at work, it says like take a pause, but it doesn't say anything about where to take that pause.
Smart city, what is it about? A livable city, how do we create it? Thank you so much for giving your valuable time to listen to Urbanistica podcast season number 2. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Don't forget to follow Instagram account to see the stories behind the scenes, and also subscribe the YouTube channel to see the live talks. Let's get in touch on LinkedIn, share your reflections with us, with Urbanistica community, recommend the podcast to people you think are interested in Urbanistica topics. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. This is gonna be the first episode of the second season of Urbanistica podcast. I'm looking forward to this episode. Gonna be super interesting. We're gonna talk about Artwell and how art can empower the mental and physical health. I have the pleasure to welcome my guests, Sarah and Kirsten, to Urbanistic podcast. Hey and welcome.
Hey, Mustafa. Hi, Mustafa. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much, by the way, for reaching out. I'm really happy. The topic is very interesting.
So great. We felt like it was immediately an important topic that you should bring up, and you seem like such an approachable guy, so we just thought, we need to get in touch.
Yeah, and I was really happy. I was on the homepage reading, so I'm really, excited about this.
Great, we are too.
Yeah.
Yes. So how is it now? Are you both in Stockholm? Sarah, you're Stockholm?
Yeah, I'm in Stockholm, just south of Stockholm, out in the archipelago, actually, at Dalarö.
Nice. And Kirsten, you're?
I am also on Dalarö in a different space, but we both live on Dalarö, so we're both here, getting ready for vacation.
Yes. It's going to be interesting this vacation, especially with the COVID-19 and the lockdown. I guess you're going to be in Sweden, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Yes, there's no, actually, I was thinking for the most part, but then I just realized, yes, we are grounded. We normally spend most of the summer in Canada, but this year it will be very local, which is good too. There's so many great things to see in Sweden. So there's
Absolutely.
Exactly. Sometimes I feel bad because I'm not so much locally, but because of the COVID-19 now I got used to know the neighborhood, the local restaurants, and also now the different beautiful places here in Sweden as well. So it's the positive side of the pandemic.
Yeah, totally agree.
So let's start with our storytellers. Today you are our storytellers. So we can start with you, Kirsten. How would you like to introduce yourself, and please tell us about your passion?
Okay, my name is Kirsten Hinder. I'm Canadian originally, and I'm co-founder of Artwell together with Sara. I guess publicly, I would say a little bit about my experience. I spent 15 years working within the fields of interior design and photography. And then more recently, I did a master's at Stockholm's University in curating art and with an emphasis on international law and management. And that was a really great experience because I've always had an appreciation and a fascination and curiosity about art, and so it gave me a really great context to pursue that in. So I worked both experience in the institutional context and in the private context, both curating, project leading, art directing, and also with some private consultancy. Personally, I would say that I am driven by anything to do with aesthetics, particularly fine art and design. But I love basically everything aesthetic. I have a real sensitivity, I would say, to space and light. That probably comes from my years of working as a photographer with natural light, so that I'm very aware of small changes in spaces, and I almost get a bodily reaction to spaces that aren't feeling balanced or in harmony. So that's sort of like become a life quest, which of course really impacts Artwell and our work with Artwell, to make sure that spaces can be as balanced as possible so that people feel well in them. And that's what we're going to talk more about today.
Yeah, very interesting journey from country to country, from university to university, from a field to another field.
Yes.
And Sarah, so the storyteller number 2.
Yeah.
I would like to introduce yourself. Tell us about your passion.
Yeah. Well, I have a completely different background, which is why we complement one another so well within Artwell. I actually have a long experience working with different leading roles in change management and project management, mainly within the finance industry, both in Sweden and internationally as well. And that has, the change management, that had taught me a lot of insights from large corporates in terms of how people are working and how people are feeling when they're working, and how actually spaces within different corporate environments can affect the way that you are conducting your work and how you make your colleagues feel. So I'm very passionate about making, I wouldn't say life, but making people feel good. I have a strong drive and a big portion of empathy, and that has always been throughout my working life. But as well as I studied, I was very active in the student unions, for example, just always wanted to making changes a part of life and something good about it. So I have a Master of Science in Business Administration and Economics. So and the biggest part I spent in the finance industry, but now I totally changed gears and changed direction, which is fantastic.
Yeah,
it's so fantastic to feel how you can use whatever you've been working with previously and still use your skills in new ways, and that's brings me passion as well.
I wanted to ask you, was it hard to leave your comfort zone and start in this field?
It is both ways. It's different comfort zones, but I'm really passionate about what we want to achieve within Artwell. So that's just really, really positive. That's not like stepping out of a comfort zone, because that's more like, oh gosh, this is what's been sort of lacking a bit in my life. But of course, then you have the other part of the comfort zone in well, I had a full-time job and now I have my own business, and so it's different aspects, but it's all positive. And I think it's so good to just stop doing a bit. If you've been doing something for a really, really long time, just if you have the possibility, just to take a small pause and feel okay, so what else can I do? What else can I achieve? And what can I use my energy for? So, yeah.
I would love to speak more about this, that in case you feel positive about a new business, just go for it, try it.
Yeah.
What the worst case scenario could be, but this will save it to the end of this episode. So let's start with Artwell. Tell me about the background. How did you start it and why?
Well, it was actually art that brought me and Kirsten together. When I was leaving the finance industry, I chose to do that, and me and my husband were looking for a piece of art to put in our home. And since Kirsten and I were distant, we knew each other a bit of it from a distance, so we contacted her, and she helped us with a fantastic piece. And once we got it installed, the piece, I recognized that every day as I walked down the stairs, I just had this huge smile on my face as I saw this beautiful piece of art. And it was fantastic. And even for my husband and the kids, they started engaging. What is this and why? It was such a big topic over the dinner table. And that was fantastic. And of course, I gave that feedback to Kirsten. And then we had these fantastic conversations, of course. And we were really curious about, what's the research behind this? And we started looking into it and more. And it's so interdisciplinary as well. But that was actually the beginning of Artwell, I would say.
Yeah. And Kristen, why you name it Artwell?
Well, the name kind of came, it grew organically out of different ideas that we had. But of course, a lot of the things that we're talking about and preaching are about the art of well-being or the art of wellness. So that was one aspect, but then it's double-edged because it's also art is very central to our spaces. It's one of several elements that we're using in multisensory spaces. So it just made sense to combine the two. And we did have discussions about the risks of hanging our hooks on the word art, because for some people it's so charged with so many, with either prestige or so many ideas of, people either feel that they know about art or they don't know about art. But as we'll talk about later, it's not so much about art per se, but about using art as one element in a mix of elements that can positively impact people's well-being. So we thought it just rhymed well with our ideas and has a good sound to it as well, hopefully memorable for people.
Yeah, I really like the name. And Sarah, when did you start it? Was it like many years ago or just recently?
No, it's about 1.5 years ago we started Artwell. So it's like not totally new, but still fairly new.
Yeah, so like now you're in a startup phase.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah. And Kristen, what does the research show in terms of how art contribute to the mental and physical well-being?
The research shows there's lots of positive impacts that experiences of art can give. One is chemical in terms of reducing the stress hormone cortisol, and can also lead to reduced feelings of stress and anxiety. Can help people increase their positive sense of themselves, because it gives them a relationship of themselves to a lot of things in the universe around them that gives them, it helps us become said and feel like we know our place in relation to other things. We can get a better sense of ourselves, which creates self-esteem and can also impact our levels of empathy. Can also trigger positive memories, which is good for all of us, but it's also particularly interesting for research concerning Alzheimer's and dementia, and how we can counterbalance or counteract memory loss with positive experience of art. And then I think also, not to be understated, is the importance of how much it can inspire us to see things in new and different ways, which is of course directly linked to being able to solve problems in our private lives and in our business lives or in school environments, so that people really get new perspectives and new energy and inspiration, which helps us be rejuvenated on a regular basis.
Yeah, so there is a science that back up how important art is, and not, because the stereotype is about artists or people that in love with art. It's abstract, and there's not really a science behind it.
Right. Now, there is a science behind it for sure. And I think one thing, as I mentioned before, about it not being so much, it's not the way we're using art in our spaces is not the way people use art in galleries or museums. We're using it as one of several multisensory elements, and it becomes like a vehicle to transport people away from the stress or anxiety they might be feeling in their daily lives into another space, even if it's just for a short period, so they have the opportunity to cross a threshold and leave everything that they don't want to think about outside and be stimulated in different parts of their brain, so that in a short period of time they can be occupying their thoughts with other things that allows their prefrontal cortex to relax and be restored in this period of time. So, it's contributing this series of different curated elements together, which bring people into a much more effective micropause, you could say, so that they're better equipped to attack the rest of their day, even after just a short break. And we know the benefits of micropauses. There's so much research stemming from NASA's own practices to all kinds of different neuroscience. There's a ton of research there. So it's just a case of how we choose to take those micropauses. Of course, as individuals, different things can be more or less effective, and people's stress tolerance levels are also quite different. So not one solution is good for all of us, but it's good that we have a variety of solutions and recognize that different people have different needs and how we can offer solutions that suit everybody.
Exactly. Different people have different stories. Sarah, do you still feel excitement when you look at the art piece that you get for
I
some
do.
years ago?
I do. Yeah. Every day, several times per day. It is fantastic because it's different and it comes out differently in different lighting. And yeah, it is amazing. And I must say that I didn't have a lot of experience from art previously. This is actually the first piece that we bought, but it's like, oh gosh, I'm so happy with it because it really brings a very nice calm feeling looking at it, or I can just sit and take some deep breaths and look at it because I know it does me good, you know. But it's fascinating about, I mean, we talked about research and there's a lot of science behind. It's very interdisciplinary. I mean, what we're doing is very interdisciplinary, but it's a great scientist called Esther Sternberg in the US, and she's talking about healing spaces, and she shows that how it actually can improve your immune system, having healing spaces. And it's other Japanese scientist, Chi Ling, who's looking into the immune system there as well, and they have forestry baths. And I mean, in the architect world, you have Roger Ulrich, who already in the 1980s did this study on how patients can actually improve their health and become much more healthier, or what do you say? They improve much easier when they're looking at nature rather than a brick wall. So it's like massive, the amount of research that exists, which is fantastic. And also today, we know that the interdisciplinary scientists also are starting to talk to each other because it's not just one factor, it's so many different ones that can really help improving our health and mental health as well.
Yeah, and as we know, like art is very broad, very big thing. So what are the elements that you're using in order to contribute to a good mental health? Is it paintings, sculptures, lighting?
We're using basically, it's not specific to a media. We're using a variety of different elements, including lighting, different art media, including could be sculptural. Right now, we're working a lot with video art. We're using scent. We are using soundscape. We are using tactile surfaces, and we are using materials that are natural, because all of the science points to how each of these different elements can have a restorative effect. And we don't necessarily use all elements in a space, depending on the size and the complexity of the space. But it's good to know, back to, again, from an individual's perspective, we all have different needs and respond well to different types of restorative processes. So that's sort of the wide spectrum. And then the art is not so much about the art in itself. People will say, well, art is so subjective. You know, how do you choose art that everyone feels good about? And it's not really so much about a specific media or style or subject matter. It's more about choosing art that incorporates the elements that we know from science, has the palette, the form, the textures, the natural elements that all combined, we know, make us feel better. So whether somebody says, oh, I don't like that painting or not, that's not really about that, because we know, yes, it is subjective, but the art is more, as I said before, like a vehicle to transport people together with the other elements into a space where they can be relieved from their stress and recover from whatever anxiety they're suffering from, or just on a preventative basis, which is it's super important that we don't just seek help when we feel totally run down and like we hit the wall, that we have habits that need to be changed. So over time, we realize that, you know, we get small triggers. We understand, okay, now I just need a change of environment, have a space accessible to me where I am when I need it. And that's super important, that you don't have to do all the work yourself, that we help people by giving them spaces that are accessible and filled with the right content, so that their restoration is effective and can happen when they need it and not have to wait for it.
Yeah. So now we are talking also about spaces, about different rooms.
Yes.
So would you like to share? I'm interested. How do you do it? Like the process from the meeting the person until the person is super happy. As how can we see it in Sarah's face?
Well, I mean, each every space is unique and tailor-made after our client's needs, of course, but we're always using like a 7-step process. And that is contained by a pre-study where we're analyzing the situation of today with a client. And then we have the concept where we come up with a concept that would be good for that situation. Either it's like a low budget, very small space, or it's a bigger space. I mean, all dependent on what the client wants. And then we have the design part, which is where we specifically choose the different elements that we want to get into the space. And then we have the installation phase, which is quite self-evident. And then we have education as well, which is sort of like, it depends on where that part comes in, but it is very important to have seminars, workshops, and talks to people. Let's say it is at a corporate, to talk to them so they understand why this is important and why we're doing it, because it's not just as any space. This is very specific, as you know. And it's also very important during this whole process that we, of course, have management, because this is a leadership question as well. It's not about entering a space or not. It's about allowing. It's a lot of stigma surrounding also the taking small breaks for restoration. So the management is continuous as well, but that's within the education part. And then we have the curating, where we ensure that the space's content is relevant and updated. And then we have the evaluation, which is sort of like ongoing, because it's important to know how it's working and that people are using it, or is it something that is not working, etc. So it's like a 7-step process, which is pretty straightforward, actually.
And are we talking about like private houses or big offices? What are the scale of the spaces we are talking about? Because usually, or maybe this is also a stereotype, people like to be alone with the art piece to enjoy it. But is it possible to scale it up?
We're talking about basically, just to simplify things for ourselves, we early on identified 3 different target audiences. The first is education, the second is corporates, and the third is within healthcare. And the reason we targeted these 3 audiences is because we have a life cycle philosophy, so that, when we're born and at an early age, we're being educated, and then later in life, we spend much of our life working, and at the final stages of our life, we're being cared for. So that's hence the educational, corporate, and healthcare environments. And the concept is adaptable and scalable fully. So we have everything from a corner concept that requires 1 square meter to a larger space where several people can flow freely in and out when they want to, for as much time as they feel is necessary, to concepts outdoors, which we can talk a little bit more in terms of urban planning. But the idea is that we identify what the needs are in a specific situation, come up with a plan for what size and level of complexity is appropriate in that situation, and make sure that we are responding to the client's needs and giving them what they need. We have had requests to do something in a private home as well, but more commonly it's larger spaces, but not necessarily for several people at one time. As you mentioned, Mustafa, a lot of people feel like to get that space, they need a sense of feeling that they're alone and almost cocooned. And that's something that, we encounter in different contexts. So, okay, in this case, we want a space maybe that several people can take part in, but they still want to feel like they're alone. And that's a challenge, which is a really fun challenge, because we get that that's a need that a lot of people have, that screening off and the capacity to just feel like I'm on my own here and I just need my 5 minutes. People say, I just need to have 5 minutes to collect my thoughts. And interestingly enough, when we ask people, because we've interviewed probably 200 people about this, what's your go-to space? When you need to just collect your thoughts at work, where do you go? So before we tell you what the answer is that we've received most, Mustafa, what is your space for that? Do you have a go-to space for recovery?
Lying on my bed and closing my eyes, actually.
Good.
That's healthier than the 80% of the people that we've asked that question have said they go to the toilet at work.
Really?
It's the only place to be undisturbed is in the toilet stall. And there is something, it's both offers the enclosed space, which is quite small and confining and feels safe in a sense. So that makes sense. But it feels so inhumane and wrong that that's the only place that people feel like they can be undisturbed and actually gather their thoughts. And if they need to get energized or if they need to just exhale and sink their shoulders, it's quite sad. And then we have people who say that, they go, it's lucky my office space has several different floors because I can just disappear up to the 7th floor and nobody knows where I am. It's awful because it really feels like it's not a positive retreat that it could be. It feels like just escaping and hiding from the stress and anxiety that is bogging people down. So that's awful, which is one thing that we're responding to, is to try to offer alternatives for that.
Yeah.
So how do you solve it? That's very, to be honest, very depressed, very sad to hear that people run to the toilet. It's not that I'm not, how to say, disrespect the toilet as a function, but I mean, architecture
but that's
should
the safe space.
I mean, we are humans, should be creative and more in finding other solutions that providing a toilet as a place. So how do you solve this?
Well, I mean, it's not an easy solution. I mean, this is about trying to get people to understand and kill some stigmas about restoration, because you often get, like today we're talking about the activity-based offices, and they talk about, well, we have a space where you can interact, we have a space for collaboration, we have a space for where it can be silent, but it's always an achievement. You always need to do something in those spaces. And it's very seldom there is a space just for restoration. So, I mean, it's about convincing management. It's about convincing perhaps other collaborators that this is important. So this is that's why also we're so happy to be able to take part of your podcast, Mustafa, because we do feel that there is sort of I wouldn't say a lack, but there is a lack of understanding on why this is so important. And still we're talking so much about well-being today. We talk so much about sick leaves. We talk so much about what you can do to feel better. We talk about exercise, and we talk about restoration, but we don't talk enough about what you can do to actually get that restoration, and how you can get that at work. When you look at like different suggestions for like, okay, so this is ways that you can recover at work. It says like, take a pause, but it doesn't say anything about where to take that pause, because also imagine that almost 50% of the population is introvert and the other rest is extrovert. So for an introvert to be in spaces where you like have this beautiful lounge areas, but you always need to interact, because even, of course, taking a cup of coffee is some sort of break, but it
requires something.
It with energy. Yeah. And it's so much, it drains energy from an introvert person. It drains energy just by going and talking by the coffee machine or having lunch or an after work with your colleagues. But even extroverts need, sometimes a break from like everything happening around us. And we do think that it's so important that we're quite stunned actually that not more are taking this into consideration, or are rather referring to the coffee areas and beautiful lounges. I mean, there's so many beautiful offices today. So it's
as a little anecdote, we did a workshop recently at a company that prides itself on its sustainable profile. And one of the women in the workshop, when we posed the question, where do people find their restoration? Out of 5 women, 2 said there's just no time. 2 said they go to the toilet. And 1 said, well, I do actually sit in the sofa area where it's comfortable furniture and a nice space. But I have a prop with me. I hold a book. I don't read the book, but I feel like I have to hold the book in front of me to show that I'm doing something. And this is so interesting and tragic, but so interesting, and just cries out the need to do something about this, because to feel like we're not worthy and we're not positively contributing to our workspace or to society if we're not active all the time is such a big problem. Yeah. And the feeling of having to not only be active, but to communicate how active you are, because that produces likes, that produces a place in society. That produces maybe a raise in your job. We are rewarding this overactive connectedness that we're all suffering from. And the more we, the higher people say jump, we jump, because we know there's a reward at the end of that. Nobody rewards somebody for saying, you know what, I just feel like a little bit down today. I feel like I need to just stay home and take care of myself.
No,
There's no reward.
You're not allowed to say to feel
No.
that.
No.
And it's the most natural thing in the world. If more people did that, then we would not have the high personal and economic costs of long-term sick leaves, of the rising mental health issues. The World Health Organization predicted, this is years ago before anybody heard of COVID-19, but that the world's leading global health problem by 2030 would be depression. And it's like, if we're not already there, we're going to be there before 2030. It's so, it requires that we really relearn how to be inactive and the value of that, and respect people's inactivity, and respect when people say it's about being and not necessarily doing something, because every time we're doing something and expected to produce something and expected to deliver something and expected to show ourselves publicly, we come further and further away from being able to have this balance, which we need inside of us in order to feel well. It's not any surprise that the World Health Organization expanded their definition of good health to include mental health, because there is so much emphasis on physical health and on social well-being. But mental health is, of course, the third part of that equation that has always been on the back burner. And it's becoming more and more something that people have latched onto and are understanding the importance of, but there still are stigmas. We were just talking this morning about how when Dag Hammarskjöld was the Secretary of the United Nations in 1957, they inaugurated this room dedicated to well-being, because he could see that people really needed a place to retreat to in order to escape the stresses of their daily work environment and the hectic pace of life. And, that was in 1957. It's like we still haven't, a lot of workplaces, particularly, and schools, haven't understood that yet. So he was, a real pioneer and ahead of the time. But we have to sort of get back on that train and change people's mentalities about what is worthwhile and how we can be somehow balanced. It's not about, we can't be sustainable possibly in terms of climate or in terms of economy or in terms of leadership if we're not sustainable first as individuals. And we've sort of forgotten, we've stepped over that. It's like, if we all are broken, we can't possibly have any positive effect on our surroundings or anything else.
Yeah, I'm listening to you. It's very interesting what you're sharing in terms of facts, experience, and knowledge. So what I understand is not only about art; it's about the mindset that you need to have this mindset. And I believe you're educating in this part as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So would you like to share with us, what do you really focus on when you educate? Is it only about the art piece, or about what kind of mindset you need to have in order to?
Yeah. No, what we educate on is, first of all, so everybody has sort of the same base. What is the problem? So everybody actually gets the seriousity of the problem, because it is, and there's so many statistics and things like that. And it's, as Kirsten mentioned, the WHO, but also the Global Goals 2030. Everybody are addressing that mental well-being is very important, and it's very stressful within the whole world, actually, however it's like an epidemic. It's going in totally wrong direction. So we're educating on that, but we're also educating on the why it's important to take the micropauses. And that's also, it's not a lot of people who knows actually the real benefits of taking the micropauses, and how the prefrontal cortex needs actually to offload sometimes, because otherwise if you get more stress, you're making worse decisions, you're not being a nice person or a colleague or a husband or a wife. So you have all those facts, but we really try to sort of nail them. But also we're talking about how these multisensory elements are actually helping you offload your prefrontal cortex and actually making you restore in a much better way. And there is art one part of it, as Kirsten mentioned previously. So it's a combination of all these elements, because it's so interdisciplinary. We're using research and inspiration from disciplines such as neuroscience, architecture, behavioral science, psychology. So that's just a couple. And just trying to combine that and make people understand and how to prioritize actually taking time for recovery. And every time actually that we do these talks and meeting people, it's so fascinating because every time they say like, oh my God, you're so right. Why don't we have that? And yes, I go to the toilet, so it is really a big need out there. And then of course we're talking about our the different ways that you can implement spaces and how you can use these elements to construct something. And it can be really tiny or it can be very large. It's not about like, not very much about money or no, we don't have that room. It's about like the mental part. But then of course, it's one thing to have a large talk to people just to enlighten them, but then it's discussion, it's serious discussions with management within the corporates and the organizations. And it's often a combination that you talk to like HR, you talk to like upper management, but maybe even facility management sometimes. So it's not just one single question within the companies either, which is like, it's a bit of a challenge sometimes to like hit the right person to talk to. And then you have architectures if it's a project. So it's very it's a large variety. But I mean, we do, to summarize it, it is a lack of knowledge out there, and that actually like reclaiming the sustainability word, because now it's very much about sustainable investments and sustainable climate, but the sustainable individual, like the life cycle. I mean, if you can't be a sustainable individual, it's hard for you to be like sustainable in the other things that you do. And it's hard to get the sustainable societies. It all comes together. And that's also what we talk a lot about. And you can really see that some people like, yeah, I can be sustainable. I haven't thought about that, because it is an important word, but it's a bit hijacked sometimes. So
I think also, can I just interject and say something about the spaces? Because I think the curatorial aspect is something that people need to understand, because people could say like, oh, but we have an interior designer, and then we have to say, we have to educate them about the difference, because yes, interior designers are super important. The architects are super important. There's all these different people bringing things to the mix, but what we're doing is not the same thing, and that requires education. We realize that in some ways our concept is a little bit abstract for people to understand, but it is this intricate dance between these different elements that are all scientifically proven to make us feel better that we're working with. So, for instance, if I'm choosing a piece of art for a client in their private home, and I know they are super social and want to have it in a space that gives off a real party atmosphere or a certain energy, or then I choose one piece. But if I'm working on an Artwell space and we're curating different elements for that, then there's a totally different set of parameters in mind. So it's not about, a specific artwork in itself. It's about what that artwork, together with these other elements, brings to this mix, which is like a cocktail of different things that is so important that it's right. And that's where my maybe like nerdy oversensitivity to space and allergy towards spaces that feel unbalanced and inharmonious comes in handy, because I'm like the lab rats. Like if I feel good in the space, then most people will feel good in the space. So it is a craft, and that's a science in itself that people need to understand, because it's not just, but we have a big corporation and then we have an art collection. Okay. That means nothing if you're not using it in the right way. Does it reflect your company's values? Are you having somebody help you with putting pieces in the right places? Or do you have a room that people can go in, as you said, Mustafa, where they can contemplate a piece in isolation? I know so many people who say, even in my own house, I just can't get peace. And that's something that, or people who say the only peace I get is in the toilet or driving my car. I can be sitting in traffic, but I don't care because I'm alone. And that's something that a lot of people are struggling with today. So we need to help them. We need to make these spaces accessible so that people feel like restoration is there for them, so that it just becomes a natural part of our day, interjected throughout the day, when we feel like we just need 5 minutes to mentally prepare for something, or to, we just before we go to pick up our kids at doggies, or when we arrive having sat in traffic on the way in, just to like keep that balance so that we don't end up hitting the wall, which so many people do. So it's a preventative mentality.
Exactly. And me as an urban planner, I'm interested, is it possible to scale it up to city level, or now we lose the value, the magic of this?
No, I think it's definitely possible to scale it up at absolutely. With interventions or even small spaces, I think it should be accessible within urban spaces, because it's something that should, both from a democratic perspective, it shouldn't only be reserved for people who have access to a space in their place of work or in their school or in their care facility. It should be something that we feel, people who are in transit in urban spaces or don't have that sense of calm in their homes can go out and find that. And I think there is so much opportunity to use these elements outside as well, and to create these little oases for people to feel that when they have time, or they can seek it out, that it's something, in some senses there's a class issue where the spaces that are most restorative are reserved for people who can afford maybe to go into a lounge at an airport, or can afford to go for a stay at the spa. But it should be something that's accessible to everyone, irrespective of class, race, gender. It's really a democratic and accessibility issue that's super important.
And as you know, we talk a lot about cities and smart city in the Urbanistica podcast. So I would love to hear from you also, how do you define a smart city? So Sarah, what is a smart city for you?
I think a smart city is a city which is very inclusive. I mean, it should be for everybody, dependent on gender and color and all of that. And I think it should be also very human-centered. And I know, Kirsten, you had some more thoughts on this, right?
Well, something that we talk a lot about amongst the two of us, which I think applies to a smart city heavily, is it's about creating a city that helps people reach their full potential. So, that's, of course, very, very different for different individuals. But if it's not lifting people up and allowing them to reach their potential, then it's not a smart city. No amount of technology or innovation can do that. I think it has to be a living organism where small receptacles are taking in information all the time from the variety, the cross-section of people who are living there, and making small adjustments. So it's not a case of deciding, okay, this is the way it's going to be, and then 30 years later realizing nothing has changed. It has to be a constant evolutionary process where we're making small changes, that we make sure we're updating things so that we are reaching a broad variety of needs. And that involves listening and collecting data and not just theorizing, but to actually do things, because I think that is super, it's a trap that I think we fall into when we're working on large municipal projects, is that there's so many layers of information and people involved, so many different actors with different agendas, and just the bureaucratic aspect slows us down, and we talk a lot about changing, and by the time the change is implemented, sometimes it's almost obsolete. So speeding up the process and a little bit more spontaneity. Of course, there needs to be forethought and pre-studies, I get that, but I think the process is often too slow and not as responsive enough. So hopefully at the end of the day, a smart city balances people's needs, because it needs to be human-centered, with economic needs and technology and well-being, and all together helps people reach their potential.
And whose responsibility to speed up the process?
Whose responsibility is it? I think it's, in a democracy, I think it's us as voters, because I think the politicians in the end of the day have a lot of say and are the decision makers, and we are the ones who are democratically electing the people who are going to make those decisions. So we have to be very clear about what our wishes are, and maybe have more contact with our local politicians to really push issues forward, because I think there's, in some cases, just a lack of knowledge when it comes down to this decision-making process happening. And I think there's so many knowledgeable people sort of bringing together the ideas and presenting them. But then if the person at the top of the ladder just doesn't get it, then it just falls on deaf ears, or maybe the decision-making process doesn't go as it should. So I think we need to put more pressure on our politicians to implement the kind of cities that we want to live in, and then they need to take more responsibility to actually do their jobs.
What is your reflection, Sarah, about speeding up the process? Is it possible?
I mean, it's with the political structure that we're having, I think it's a struggle sometimes about the ways that the amount of time it takes to actually get something working in the way. I mean, if you're looking at Stockholm, you have the city hall and you have the people working for the city and with all the planning and what they're doing. But then still, it's so many steps that you would need for get it approved. So I would say that perhaps looking into, depending on what it's about, to actually speed up the process, because there are so many good ideas and there are so many people out there that want to achieve the same thing and that we're not happy. And we need to be able to make changes a bit like like a fast lane. So I think to perhaps look at that and perhaps look at other. I mean, we do have a political process, which I think is very important, but dependent on what we're deciding on, maybe also have different kinds of like challenge a little bit in the way that we're working with these questions, and perhaps set together different kinds of groups. And like I said, the fast lane to get stuff improved. And it doesn't have to be everything like for 10 years, but like small steps as well, and try different ways of doing it, because you need, I mean, that's what we're talking about as well. You need to start changing behavior, and you need to start challenging some processes that might work or not work. And you need to start like have a daredevil saying, let's try this. And what's the worst thing that can happen, And I think that should also be for like, the urban planning as well, and dependent on what's important. And now with the climate and like mental well-being, I think it would be so nice to be able to do something. Okay, let's do this, because this is not, it doesn't depend on this, and it doesn't affect this and this. So let's just try it out and just do it. It's so much talking.
So basically the change starts from us. We shouldn't wait for someone else to.
No. You obviously always need to like talk to people about what you want to do, but it's also important to listen, because sometimes people are so stressed or busy with their own, so they're like, no, okay, I have my job description, I'm doing this, and then someone comes in and say like, well, do you want to try this, and they're like, ooh, perhaps, but I don't have time now. So that is sort of like almost like down, yeah,
it's a little bit of a vicious cycle.
Swedish, it is, and that is a problem. And it would be nice to have like think tanks or whatever discussions about, okay, so how can we speed it up? And like I said, less talking, just do it.
Yeah. And if I would like to ask you for a change, if we go back in time and you're allowed to change one thing related to architecture, urban planning and design, so what will you change? This change will be applied in all cities. What will you do? Just one thing.
I would say more urban forests. I think urban forestry, we have so much research pointing to all the benefits of forests and nature and being in nature. And with each generation, we get further and further away from nature and more disconnected. It's not a surprise that since we spent 99.9% of our evolution in nature, that our bodies and minds crave nature. And now the risk of new generations who don't get to experience that, they're just really losing touch with the value of nature. I think that's a big risk that we could have avoided if we had kept more urban forests and developed urban planning with that in mind, because I think it's something. Stockholm has lots of nice green spaces, but I think it's the constant struggle between economics and well-being. It's like, and I think often there's a lot of foresightedness instead of thinking long-term. People want to make a statement and do something drastic, and then something gets done and you can't undo it. So I would wish that we had put more focus on urban forests from the beginning.
Yes, very important. Yeah. Sarah?
And I would go for like, pedestrians only, like take away the traffic. That's and that comes also, of course, I mean, that would bring more space for urban forestry, but it's from many angles. I mean, it's of course the environmental issue, but also like reclaiming the city back to the citizens and to the people living in the cities. And with that comes, of course, nature as well. And I think that some cities today are more planned about traffic And I mean, of course, you can always solve logistics, right? And it's also about, okay, but it takes longer time if you walk, but calm down, don't be stressed. You don't have to rush, or you get stuck in traffic, which gives you stress. So I think pedestrians only,
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
say.
Exactly. This is what we're working with as well daily, like to bring back the nature to the city and make it less car dependent.
Yeah, exactly.
It's gonna take time, but hopefully we're gonna approach this.
Yeah, of course. But you need to start sometime, right? I mean, it's always like
Yeah.
that. You need to.
Many cities are already started, like in the downtown. No, they're not allowing cars only for the logistic or public transportation. So, and it works. So cities are learning from each other, but as you know, it takes time.
Yeah, of course.
And if I ask you to do one change, what will you add to the cities? Something that you're allowed to add, apart of what you mentioned now.
Can we add restorative spaces?
How what are you thinking about?
Well, it would just be a fantastic thing to know that people did have access to restorative spaces throughout the city. So, just roll out small pods, cocoons, something where people just know that it's within reach, and when they have just a moment or two and need to just screen out. And because I think that preventative, building that into our habits, of course, it has to do with changing habits. But I think thinking preventatively is something that we're not very good at in Sweden. And I think we often put Band-Aids on situations and, try to put the fire out in the meantime, because it's maybe cheaper and quicker to do that, but we don't think long term. So in order to build people up and make sure they don't end up in long term with long-term illnesses or other health impacts, mental or physical, that we just need to make sure that people have new habits for restoring themselves on a regular basis.
Yeah, especially now you have science actually showing that urban citizens are more and more disconnected to nature, and they don't even know longer what they've lost. And urban citizens are also more exposed to anxiety and depression. So it's really, and I mean, that's scientifically proven. It's a German study, but it's so important as well to why is it important to have these restorative places or forests or whatever, so people are encouraged to actually take time for restoration and rebooting. And so it is a really serious, it's a really a public health issue as well.
And often today we talk about how much of the responsibility for this lies on individuals. If somebody doesn't feel well, then they're encouraged to get a pass at the gym or to go to a yoga session or to do meditation. But we also need to help them through urban planning and through employers and corporations and through leadership at schools and within healthcare to foster environments and a mentality. That's why we say often, what we're doing is making space for well-being or making space for resilience. It's not about just the physical space, it's also the mental space. It's so necessary to create this space, which has to do with education, it has to do with empathy, it has to do with the way we value different things. And if an employer encourages, not only has a physical space for it, which employees just in that appreciate that somebody does that for them, something other than the toilet stall or the wheel room, which is just by law has to be there. But by actually making that investment in your employees or in your students and saying, okay, this is something that we want you to have because we believe that you will be at your best if you have the opportunity to take these small breaks and so that the employers need to take responsibility, the politicians need to take responsibility, urban planners also need to think about how to take that responsibility so that we all together, both as individuals and collectively, make sure that space does get designated and used in a good way.
And if I would like to ask you, how would you like to summarize this episode in the 3 takeaway messages, like the very important messages that we should take with us after this great and amazing conversation?
The first one is dare to make space for restoration, because it is about being a pioneer to some extent. And the second one is dare to think and act more preventively. we've been talking about the band-aids and the reactive parts, but we need to be more preventively.
Which often has short-term economic consequences and requires a visionary of sorts. But the long-term benefits are so overwhelmingly positive that thinking preventatively and acting with a preventative mindset there's so many positive long-term benefits that we really need to do that. A third one, I would say, dare to reconnect with nature in a meaningful way. And that, it's not just about, and this is probably most specific to urban planning, Mustafa, so this is your backyard, but dare to think about green spaces in new ways and to think not in terms of just innovation, but multi-layered. As individuals, we have different needs and we are restored cognitively with different means. So it's not enough just to put a green space between 4 buildings and call it a park and say that people should go there. We need to draw them in and capture their attention and make sure they stay long enough to see the rewards of being in that space. And that can be an intricate theater between different multisensory elements and nature that is super inspiring. And, it's not just to create a park, but it's to create a park that people want to be in and stay in and then can reap the benefits of. So I think that's has to do with many things, but I think that's something that in some cases there are good examples of, and in some cases it could be a lot more well thought through. And I think also all of this, this is sort of a fourth takeaway message, but just to sum up all of that stuff, I would say that we need to start remembering that restoration is not a luxury, but it's a basic human need. That's something that I think a lot of people see it as, I'm going to take some me time. It's not about taking me time to be selfish or because you're egotistical. It's about actually responding to the needs you have. I need to go out for a walk now. It's not because I don't want to be with my family, but it's because I feel that what I'm going to get out of that walk in nature, or what I'm going to get out of that visit to an art space or whatever is going to replenish the energy that I've lost when I'm working or healing or studying. So this balance and equilibrium is so important to recognize that, we can't just give. We also have to take. And we need to do that as individuals, to have that little voice that tells us, now I've given too much of myself. Now I need to take something back. Find the right space for restoration. So it's a big responsibility for all of us. But it's so important.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the very, very interesting takeaway messages. I'm very happy, very glad that we had this conversation.
Thank you so much.
So are we.
And the 3 hashtags for the episode.
Well, the 3 hashtags. We have one called Spaces of Mind. I don't know if we said, but we call our spaces of mind because it's a well described. It describes well what we're actually doing, giving the mind some space. So spaces of mind is one. Restorative spaces is the second one. And they're not in a specific order. And then sustainable individuals, of course.
Yeah.
So those 3.
Yes. Thank you so much again. And I will be super glad to meet you in the real life, and we talk further about the different interesting topics in the future.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Thank you
come
so
to
much.
Dalarö.
Yes. By the way, did you plan for the summer vacation, or what is going to be next now?
Well, yeah, it is a bit of a summer vacation in a couple of weeks, but we still have some stuff within Artwell that we need to plan for the fall, and have some other things. But it's vacay coming up. Yeah.
But as we mentioned in the beginning, it's going to be more Swedish based.
Yeah. Which is not bad at all.
It's beautiful. I believe it's going to be super beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mustafa.
And thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. Please don't forget to follow on Instagram and subscribe the YouTube channel for the talks. And if you have any great story, just email me just how these great people did. and now we learn so much about interesting topic. Urbanistica is being produced in collaboration with Landskapslaget, that working with landscape architecture, urban planning and design, based in Stockholm. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.